My husband and son thought I was just a useless housewife for 30 years. They had no idea I was the secret chairman of the city's most powerful financial group. Right at the dinner table, my husband casually stated in front of his mistress, "She hasn't worked a day in her life, she knows nothing about business." I didn't argue. I quietly cleared the dishes, walked down the hallway, and overheard their plot to strip me of everything. 2 minutes later, I made a decision that changed everything. I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Your country, your city. I love knowing who is in this community with me. Now let's get into the story. Please note some elements in this story are fictional, added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental, but the message waiting for you at the end is one worth carrying. My name is Margaret Collins. Most people call me May. For 30 years, that name has meant the same things to the same people. Gerald's wife, Brandon's mother, the woman who kept the house running so quietly that no one ever stopped to wonder how it got done. The one who refilled your coffee before you noticed it was empty, who remembered everyone's preferences and no one remembered hers. Tonight was no different, at least not from the outside. The dining room smelled of rosemary chicken and the particular warmth of a house that looks like home without quite feeling like one anymore. Gerald sat at the head of the table the way he always did, his voice filling the room before the first course was even finished. He was telling Diane about a development deal, on the verge of closing his hands, moving in wide gestures that twice nearly upset his wine glass. He did not notice. Gerald rarely noticed things that were not directly about Gerald. Diane laughed at all the right moments. She had a talent for that, the particular skill of making a man feel as though everything he said was slightly more interesting than it actually was. I had watched her practice it for 4 years now, ever since she first inserted herself into Gerald's company, and I had to admit she was very good at it. "The Harrington Group doesn't partner with just anybody," Gerald said, straightening his cuffs with the satisfied air of a man who considers cuff straightening a form of punctuation. "This is the kind of deal that defines a career." "It really is," Diane agreed, touching his arm briefly across the table, just enough to mean something without being something anyone could point to directly. Brandon was on his phone. He was 32 years old, and he ate dinner with his mother the way he sent emails present in the minimum technical sense required by the situation. "May, the potatoes are getting cold," he called toward the kitchen without looking up. "Not Mom, May." I had stopped waiting for that to change. I brought the potatoes out, went back for the gravy, and stood at the stove for a moment, looking down at my hands wrapped around the gravy boat handle. These hands had once held a pen above a contract worth more than anything on Gerald's balance sheet. They had shaken hands with men whose names appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. They had built something real and lasting in the hours my husband assumed I was simply resting. My friend Dorothy had told me over coffee last spring that a person can only make themselves small for so long before the smallness becomes permanent. I had changed the subject when she said it. I always changed the subject when Dorothy got too close to something I was not ready to hear. I had thought about that sentence more times than I could count since then. Back at the table, Gerald was shaking his head about a colleague who had retired and lost his sense of purpose. "If you don't build something that lasts," he said, "you've got nothing to show for any of it." Brandon nodded. Diane smiled. Neither of them looked at me. What I noticed instead were the smaller things, the way Gerald addressed every remark about success and ambition to Diane specifically as though I were furniture that happened to be seated at the table. The way the three of them occupied the room as though it belonged to them, and I had simply been engaged to serve it. As Diane reached across to refill her wine glass, her eyes moved briefly to my phone near my place setting. The screen had lit up with a calendar notification. The Collins Capital Group logo was visible in the upper corner for no more than 2 seconds before the screen dimmed and went dark. Diane looked away faster than a person looks away from something that means nothing to them. I noticed. I always noticed. I had built a career on noticing things that other people assumed no one was watching. Gerald said at some point during the meal that I had never really had a head for business. He had not said it cruelly. He had said it the way you state something obvious, something that requires no defense, because it has never been questioned. He said it to Diane as part of a longer sentence about surrounding yourself with people who understood the language of ambition. Brandon had nodded. Diane had looked at me with exactly the right amount of sympathy. After dinner, I stood at the kitchen sink with the hot water running over the dishes. The yard was dark and still outside the window. I gripped the edge of the counter with both hands, not hard, just enough to feel something solid beneath me. I dried my hands and walked into the hallway. The study door was not fully closed. A narrow strip of yellow lamplight fell across the dark floor, and through the gap came voices I recognized, low and unhurried, and absolutely certain they were alone. I stopped walking. My hand came to rest against the wall beside the doorframe. 3 voices, 1 plan. And my name spoken in the middle of it, in a tone that told me everything I needed to know about what had been decided long before tonight. I stood very still, and I listened. The door was open just wide enough for the truth to get through. I stood with my shoulder pressed against the hallway wall, the dish towel still folded over my left arm, and I listened. Not because I had planned to, because the moment I heard Gerald say my name in that particular tone, the one that meant I was being discussed, rather than spoken to, my feet simply stopped moving. "She'll sign whatever we put in front of her," Gerald said. His voice was relaxed, comfortable, the voice of a man who has already solved a problem and is simply explaining the solution to others. "May doesn't understand these things. She never has." My chest tightened, not with surprise, with recognition. Brandon spoke next, his voice lower, but carrying the same easy certainty that had always come from growing up in a house where things were handled for him. "What about her portion of the house?" "There is no portion," Gerald said. "Diane's attorney has already drawn up the asset separation agreement. Everything in her name gets transferred before we file the petition. It's clean, it's quick, and frankly, it's more than fair." "She won't fight it?" Brandon asked. Gerald actually laughed, a short, confident sound that I felt somewhere behind my sternum. "Fight it with what she hasn't worked a day in 30 years. She has no independent assets, no legal standing to dispute the valuation, and no reason to believe she's entitled to anything beyond what we're offering." Diane's voice came last smooth and unhurried, shaped to sound almost kind. "Once everything clears, there won't be anything left to argue over. She'll leave with what she came in with." A brief pause, which between us was never very much. I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 10 years ago, on a Thursday afternoon in October, a man named Tom Reeves had called me from his office in Boston and offered me $400 million. He had been precise about the number, $400 million based on a formal independent valuation of Collins Capital Group, commissioned by his firm, one of the most respected private equity groups in the Northeast. He had given me 72 hours to consider. That evening I had sat down across from Gerald in the living room and mentioned in quiet terms that a private venture I had quietly cultivated was drawing serious interest from major regional investors. I had not named the company, nor the $400 million valuation, but I had tested the waters. I had watched his face move through mild annoyance, and then something that I had read at the time as protectiveness. He had reached across and taken both my hands in his. "May," he had said quietly, "our family needs you here, not in some boardroom chasing numbers you don't need. We have everything we need right here." I had believed him. I had called Tom Reeves the following morning and declined. Tom had been quiet for a long moment before he said, "I hope you know what you're choosing, May." I had told him I did. I had thanked him and hung up and gone to start dinner, and I had never mentioned it to Gerald again. Standing in that hallway with the lamplight from the study cutting across the floor at my feet, I finally understood what I had actually been choosing that morning. I had not been choosing my family. I had been choosing to disappear into it, and Gerald had known exactly what he was asking me to do. There was something else. Diane's voice, underneath all that careful smoothness, carried a precision that did not belong to someone who had simply fallen into this situation. The way she referenced the attorney, the asset agreement, the petition timeline, these were not the words of a woman reciting information she had recently received. They were the words of someone who had been rehearsing for this conversation for a very long time. I could not name it yet, but I felt it the way you feel the cold before you find the open window. I pushed the door open and walked in. All 3 of them turned at once. Gerald's face moved through surprise, then a rapid, practiced recovery that settled into something attempting innocence. Brandon's jaw tightened and he sat up straighter in his chair, the automatic posture of a person caught doing something they cannot immediately explain away. Diane's expression did not change at all. Not a flicker, not a flinch. That stillness told me more about her than anything she had said through the door. I crossed the room. I set the dish towel down on the edge of Gerald's desk with the same care I used for everything in that house, deliberately, quietly, with full attention. Then I looked at each of them in turn. Gerald first, then Brandon, then Diane, whose eyes met mine with a steadiness that confirmed she had absolutely prepared for this moment. "I'll have the papers ready by morning," I said. My voice came out exactly as I intended, level, certain. the voice I used when I had already made a decision and was simply informing the room of its outcome. I walked out before any of them could find the words to respond. In my bedroom, I stood in front of the mirror above the dresser and looked at the woman looking back at me. 65 years old, flowers still on her sleeve from the dinner rolls she had made from scratch that afternoon, apron strings still tied at the back, eyes that were for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, completely clear. I reached up and untied the apron strings, let them fall. And then I smiled at her, at myself, with the full, unguarded, entirely real expression of a woman who has just remembered exactly who she is and what she is capable of, and who understands with a certainty that settled into her bones, like something coming home, that tomorrow, for the first time in 30 years, she was going to stop pretending otherwise. I did not sleep, not because I was afraid, and not because I was grieving, though I understood that grief would probably find me later, the way it always does, quietly in an ordinary moment when you are not braced for it. I did not sleep because there was work to do, and I have never been the kind of woman who leaves work unfinished. By 2 a.m, I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside my elbow, and the manila folder I kept in the back of the filing cabinet in my home office, the one Gerald had walked past 1,000 times without ever opening because it was labeled in my handwriting, Household Records 2009. And Gerald had not concerned himself with household records in any year I could remember. Inside that folder were the documents I had prepared 18 months ago, when I first understood that the marriage I had built my life around was no longer the marriage I was actually living in. A settlement agreement drafted by an attorney in Hartford, whose name Gerald did not know, who had never met Gerald, and who had been extraordinarily thorough. The agreement was clean and precise, and entirely favorable to Gerald in every way that could be measured in square footage or account balances. I signed my name at the bottom of each page. 30 years of marriage documented and concluded in the particular silence of a kitchen at 2 a.m, with the refrigerator humming and the heat clicking on in the walls, and no one else awake in the house to witness it. The petition for divorce would be filed with the court that morning. The legal process itself would take months to finalize. Connecticut required a minimum waiting period before any dissolution became official, and there were procedures to follow, hearings, to schedule paperwork, to process through channels that moved at the speed of institutions rather than decisions. But the decision itself had been made the moment I heard Gerald's voice through that study door, and decisions, in my experience, are the only part of the process that actually matter. I left the signed agreement on the kitchen table where Gerald would find it. Then I went upstairs and packed one suitcase. The medium-sized one, navy blue, that I had bought for myself on a business trip to Chicago 14 years ago, and that Gerald had never noticed because Gerald did not pay attention to luggage that was not his own. I moved through the bedroom with the quiet efficiency of someone who has mentally rehearsed this moment and knows exactly what belongs to her and what does not. The photograph from the top of the dresser, Margaret and Tom Reeves at the Collins Capital Group anniversary dinner 20 years ago, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. I had kept it in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in my home office for over a decade, in a folder with no label, waiting for a day I wasn't sure would ever come. My mother's pearl earrings, the leather journal I had been keeping since 1987, and the ring, not my wedding ring, which I left on the nightstand without ceremony, but the other one. The simple gold band I had bought for myself in the spring of 1994, the year Collins Capital Group turned its first significant profit, because I had wanted something on my hand that I had earned entirely on my own, and because I had known even then, in some quiet part of myself, I had not yet learned to fully listen to that self-reliance was something worth marking. I zipped the suitcase and carried it downstairs. Dorothy's car was already at the curb when I opened the front door. She had been there for 20 minutes, she told me later, because she had known I would be ready early, and she had not wanted me standing on the porch alone in the cold. That was Dorothy. 31 years of friendship distilled into the particular act of showing up before you are asked. She stepped out of the car when she saw me. She was holding 2 paper cups from the diner on Clemson Avenue, the one we had been going to since our children were small, and the steam from the coffee rose in the cold morning air between us. "Are you sure about this, May?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing the thing they always did when she was trying not to show that she was worried. I took the coffee from her hand. It was hot through the paper cup, and I held it with both palms the way you hold something you are glad to have. "Dot," I said, "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." She studied my face for a moment the way she had been studying it for 31 years, looking for the thing underneath the thing I was saying. Then she nodded once, and something in her shoulders released. Tom called again this morning, she said as we walked to the car. I know. I set my suitcase in the trunk and closed it. Tell him I'll see him at the conference. We drove through streets that were still mostly dark, the city just beginning to find its edges in the gray early light. I did not look back at the house. There was nothing behind me that I had not already accounted for. Downtown, the building appeared through the windshield, the way it always had, 40 stories of glass and steel, and the particular authority of something built to last. Cut into the granite above the entrance in letters I had chosen myself 22 years ago were the words, Collins Capital Group. Dorothy stopped the car at the curb. Call me when you're settled, she said. I will. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood for a moment looking up at the building. The morning air was sharp and cold and tasted faintly of the river 2 blocks east. Above me, the upper floors caught the first thin light of sunrise in a way that made the glass look briefly like it was lit from within. I picked up my suitcase and walked through the front doors. The elevator was waiting. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 40th floor, and watched the lobby doors close in the mirrored panel in front of me. The woman in the reflection looked back at me steadily. Navy coat, single suitcase, the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for this specific morning and is no longer willing to wait 1 hour more. The elevator began to rise. The 40th floor smelled exactly as I remembered. Coffee printer ink and the particular quality of air that exists only in rooms where serious decisions are made on a daily basis. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that had been redecorated twice since I last walked through it in any official capacity. But the bones of it were the same, the high ceilings, the north-facing windows that ran floor to ceiling and turned the city below into something that looked from up here entirely manageable. Victor Hale was standing 6 feet from the elevator doors. Howe was 68 years old, trim and precise in the way of men who treat their personal presentation as a professional obligation, and he had been the chief legal officer of Collins Capital Group for 22 years. He had been with me since the beginning, since the days when the company occupied a single floor of a building 4 blocks east, and the entire staff could fit around one conference table. He had watched this company become what it was. He had kept its secrets the way a good attorney keeps all secrets completely without commentary and with the understanding that the information belonged to the client and not to him. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Welcome back, Madam Chairman," in the same even tone he used for everything, and held out the garment bag that was draped over his left arm. I took it without a word and walked to the private office at the end of the hall. The suit was charcoal gray Italian wool, cut in the style I had always preferred, structured shoulders. No ornamentation, nothing that drew attention to itself rather than to the person wearing it. I had bought it 3 years ago and kept it here in this office hanging in the closet behind the door for exactly this occasion. I had not known when the occasion would come. I had simply known that it would. Collins Capital Group had operated under my maiden name from the beginning. Margaret Eleanor Hargrove, the name on my law school diploma, the name on the original incorporation papers. The name Gerald had never once used in 30 years of marriage because he had always called me May Collins and assumed without ever asking that I had left everything behind when I took his name. The company existed in the world as Hargrove Capital until its 14th year when I quietly restructured and rebranded under the Collins name, by which point Gerald had long since stopped paying attention to financial news that did not directly concern his own portfolio. I changed and stood in front of the window that looked out over the city and felt something reorient itself inside me the way a compass needle finds north. When I walked into the main conference room 4 minutes later, every person in it stood up. 12 people around the table. Senior analysts, the chief financial officer, 2 members of the board who had driven in that morning at Victor's request, and Carol Simmons, the head of internal audit, who was seated at the far end with a stack of folders in front of her, and an expression that told me she had been waiting for this meeting for considerably longer than one morning. "Please sit down," I said, and they did, and I took my place at the head of the table and opened the agenda Victor had prepared, and for the next 40 minutes I ran a board meeting in the same manner I had always run board meetings, directly, efficiently, and without the performance of authority, because actual authority has never required performance. Halfway through the agenda, I set down my pen. "I need to issue a capital withdrawal directive," I said, "effective today." Victor did not react visibly, which was one of the qualities I valued most in him. He simply opened his portfolio to the relevant section and slid a single-page document across the table toward me. Collins Capital Group had been the primary anonymous investor in Gerald's development company for 11 years. The arrangement had been structured through 3 layers of intermediary holding companies, a precaution I had insisted upon from the beginning for reasons that had seemed at the time like simple prudence and that now revealed themselves to have been something more like foresight. The capital withdrawal directive would trigger the termination clauses in each of the underlying investment agreements, initiating a formal review process by Gerald's lending institutions that would, within 5 to 7 business days, result in default notices being issued against his outstanding credit lines. He would not know where it was coming from. He would not be able to stop it. I signed the directive and slid it back to Victor. "Before noon," I said. "It will be processed within the hour," Victor said. Across town in the house I had left before sunrise, Gerald was probably finishing his second cup of coffee. He was probably reading the settlement agreement I had left on the kitchen table, with the particular expression of a man who believes he has gotten exactly what he wanted. He had no reason to feel otherwise. He had no reason to feel anything except satisfied. I hoped he was enjoying the coffee. Carol Simmons cleared her throat from the far end of the table, and I looked at her. Carol was 45, meticulous in the way that the best auditors are meticulous not because they enjoy finding problems, but because they understand that problems which go unfound have a way of becoming catastrophic. She had joined Collins Capital 8 years ago, and in that time I had never known her to bring me a folder that did not contain exactly what she said it contained. She had 4 folders in front of her this morning. "Ma'am," she said, "I want to flag something that came to my attention approximately 3 weeks ago. I have been compiling documentation since then because I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." She paused. "I am now certain." "Tell me," I said. "It concerns Diane Lawson." Carol opened the top folder and slid it across the table toward me. I began pulling her transaction records in connection with the Meridian contract audit last month. What I found there led me to pull additional records going back approximately 4 years. Another pause. "Ma'am, the numbers are not reconcilable by any legitimate accounting method." I looked down at the first page of the folder. Columns of figures highlighted in yellow with Carol's annotations in the margin in her small, exact handwriting. The amount at the bottom of the page was $3,240,000. I turned the page. "How many contracts?" I asked. 23 confirmed, Carol said. "Possibly more. I flagged only the ones I could document completely." I turned another page. The methodology was not complicated, which was either bold or careless. I had not yet decided which. Shell invoices routed through a vendor account that had been established 6 months after Diane joined Gerald's company payments, approved at a level just below the threshold that would trigger automatic secondary review. Someone had understood the internal controls well enough to work around them. Someone who had seen those controls before. I closed the folder. "Send everything to Victor," I said. "Victor, I want the federal prosecutor's office to have a complete package before noon. Not a summary. Everything." Victor was already writing. "Understood." I looked at Carol. "Good work," I said. "Thorough work." Carol nodded once with the contained satisfaction of someone who has done exactly what they came to do. I turned back to the window. Below, the city was fully awake now, moving with the particular organized momentum of a weekday morning. 10,000 separate purposes, all occupying the same streets at the same time. Victor set one more folder on the table beside me, thinner than the others, no label on the tab. "There is one additional matter," he said, "regarding Ms. Lawson's history, prior to her association with Gerald Collins." He placed his hand briefly on the cover of the folder, not quite pushing it toward me. "I think you will want to read this one yourself, Madam Chairman, when you have a moment alone." I looked at the folder. Then I looked at Victor. "Close the door on your way out," I said. The folder contained 17 pages. I read all of them twice. The first time through, I read the way I always read documents that carry consequences carefully, without reaction, absorbing the information before allowing myself to have any feelings about it. The second time I read more slowly because certain details required a second look, not because they were unclear, but because the human mind resists on some fundamental level the full weight of being deliberately targeted. Her name had been Diane Crawford. She had applied for a position at Collins Capital Group 15 years ago. She had come with strong references, a clean employment history, and the particular kind of polished competence that reads in an interview setting as both capable and trustworthy. I had hired her myself. She had lasted 14 months. The termination had been quiet, as these things often are when the evidence is clear, but the amounts are small enough that prosecution feels disproportionate to the disruption it causes. She had been falsifying expense reimbursements consistently over the course of nearly a year in amounts calculated to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. The total came to a little over $19,000. I had let her go, recovered what I could through the final paycheck offset process, and moved on. It had not occurred to me that she would move on in a particular direction. I set the folder down on the desk and looked out the window at the afternoon light falling across the city. She had changed her surname within a year of leaving Collins Capital. Crawford became Lawson through a legal name change filed in Fairfield County, a process entirely within her rights, and one that left no automatic flag on a standard background check unless the person running the check knew to look for prior names. Gerald's company had run a background check on Diane Lawson. They had found nothing concerning because they had been looking for Diane Lawson. Diane Crawford was a different matter entirely. I understood now the precision I had heard in her voice through the study door, the rehearsed quality, the specific confidence of someone who had been preparing for a conversation for a very long time. She had not stumbled into Gerald's life. She had researched it, planned it, and walked into it with a complete understanding of what she intended to take and how she intended to take it. The personnel file included a copy of her termination letter signed in my handwriting. Beside it, Victor had clipped a single page of printout from a real estate industry newsletter dated 8 years ago, a brief item about Gerald Collins closing a significant commercial development deal in Hartford. Someone had circled his name in red pen. Someone had written in the margin in handwriting I did not recognize wife. One word, underlined twice. She had not chosen Gerald because he was wealthy. She had chosen him because he was connected to me, because dismantling what he had was the closest she could get to dismantling what I had built without ever having to face me directly. Until now. I picked up my phone and called Victor. He answered before the second ring. "I've read it," he said without waiting for me to speak. "She changed her name," I said. "Yes, the Fairfield County records were not difficult to find once we knew to look for a prior name." "How long have you known?" A brief pause. "I had a strong suspicion approximately 6 weeks ago. I asked Carol to begin pulling the transaction records at that point to ensure that when I brought this to you, I was bringing you a complete picture rather than a theory." "The federal prosecutor's office will have everything by noon," I said. "Carol's audit the personnel file, the name change documentation, all of it." "It's already packaged," Victor said. "I'm waiting for your confirmation to send." "Send it," I said. I set the phone down and turned back to the window. Across the city in the offices of Gerald's company, the effects of the capital withdrawal directive were already working their way through the system. Gerald's primary lender would have received the automated notification of the withdrawal within the hour. Their credit risk department would now be conducting a review of his outstanding loan portfolio, a process that would, in Gerald's case, result in default notices being issued against 3 separate credit lines within 5 to 7 business days. He would have started receiving calls by now. Not from the bank would communicate in writing as required, but from his partners, his vendors, the people who watch the financial indicators closely enough to know when something had shifted before the official notices arrived. I thought about Gerald sitting at his desk, picking up the phone for the 4th or 5th time in an hour, hearing a voice on the other end that was asking questions he did not yet have answers for. I felt no satisfaction in it. What I felt instead was something quieter, closer to sorrow than to triumph. The specific sadness of watching something fail that did not have to fail. Victor knocked twice and opened the door. "Gerald Collins's office has called twice in the last 40 minutes, he said. "They're asking to speak with the managing director of Collins Capital's real estate division." "They don't know it's us," I said. "Not yet." He paused. "Is the conference invitation ready?" I nodded. "Have it delivered to Gerald Collins's office by end of business today." Victor left. I turned back to the window, and somewhere in the city, Gerald was reaching for his phone again, and the calls were not getting any easier to answer. I was not there to watch it happen. Dorothy called me on the 3rd morning. 3 partners pulled out yesterday," she said without preamble. "Gerald had lunch with 2 of them last week, and apparently neither one mentioned anything was wrong. They just sent letters." "They always send letters," I said. "It's cleaner." Brandon called his college roommate who works at the bank. The roommate wouldn't say anything specific, but Brandon knew enough to understand what the silence meant. She paused. "He's scared, May. Gerald is performing calm, but Brandon is genuinely scared." I thought about Brandon at 22, the summer before his last year of college, sitting at my kitchen table eating cereal at noon and telling me he was going to be more successful than his father before he turned 35. He had said it without cruelty, the way young people state ambitions they haven't yet learned to be embarrassed by. I had told him I believed him. I had meant it. Let him be scared for a while, I said. It's useful. By the 10th day, the default notices had arrived from the bank, formal written notifications as required under federal lending regulations, informing Gerald that his 3 primary credit lines were under review for potential default based on material changes in the collateral structure of his investment portfolio. The language was precise and unhurried the way institutional language always is, which somehow makes it worse than anger would be. Dorothy told me Gerald read the first letter 3 times at his desk and then called Diane. Diane did not answer. Diane had not answered anyone's calls in 4 days, which was its own kind of answer. That same evening, Brandon drove to the house alone. Dorothy knew because she lived 2 streets over and recognized his car. He had gone back, he told me later, looking for the company's original insurance binder, a document he remembered seeing in the filing cabinet in my home office years ago, back when he had briefly helped me sort paperwork during a pipe leak that flooded the downstairs. He remembered the cabinet. He remembered the drawer. What he did not remember, because he had never been told, was that the drawer directly below the one he was looking for contained a folder with no label and no explanation, which had been sitting there for 11 years, waiting for exactly the kind of desperate, searching hands that were now pulling it open. I was inside for nearly 2 hours. When he came out, he was carrying something small and flat against his chest, held the way you hold something you are not yet sure what to do with. Dorothy called me immediately. "He found something," she said, "in the house. I don't know what it was, but made his face when he came out." She stopped. He looked like a man who had just been introduced to someone he should have known his whole life. I knew what he had found. I had put it there 11 years ago, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in my home office in a folder with no label, because I had not known how to offer it directly, and I had believed in the way you believe things you cannot quite bring yourself to examine too closely, that one day the right moment would present itself. Apparently it had. Brandon called my number that night. I watched his name on the screen until it stopped. Then I called Dorothy. "Let him sit with it," I said. "He cried," Dorothy said quietly, "sitting in his car in the driveway before he drove away. I saw him through the window. He sat there for a long time." I was quiet for a moment. "Good," I said, and I meant it the way a doctor means it when they say that pain is a sign that something is still alive enough to heal. The conference was in 4 days. I arrived at the hotel 2 hours before the conference began, not because I was anxious, because I have always believed that the person who controls the room is the person who is there first, who knows where the exits are, who has already spoken to the staff and confirmed the arrangements and settled into the space before anyone else arrives to claim it. 30 years of boardrooms had taught me that preparation is not nervousness wearing a different name. It is simply respect for the work. Dorothy was already at our table when I came down from the suite. She had ordered coffee for both of us and was reading something on her phone with the focused expression she wore when she was pretending to be relaxed. "They're here," she said without looking up. "Gerald and Brandon. They came in through the main entrance about 20 minutes ago. Gerald is working the room. Brandon is following him and looking like a man who hasn't slept in a week." "He probably hasn't," I said. I did not go into this main hall. I had a panel to moderate at 7:30, and before that I had 3 conversations scheduled with people I had been wanting to speak with for months. I conducted them at a corner table near the window with my back to the room because I did not need to see Gerald to know where he was. I could track him by the quality of the silence that followed him, the way conversations shifted when he entered a cluster of people, the way his voice carried that particular note of forced confidence that belongs to men performing composure they do not feel. Tom Reeves found me between the 2nd and 3rd conversations. He was 70 years old, white-haired, with the kind of handshake that has closed 100 deals and knows it. He had been my friend and my professional ally for over 2 decades, and he looked at me now, the way he always looked at me when something important was happening, and he wanted to make sure I was steady. He approached me, Tom said. "Gerald, about 40 minutes ago, asked if I knew the chairman of Collins Capital personally." "What did you tell him?" I told him I had known Margaret Collins for 22 years. Tom's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "He went very still when I said your full name." "I imagine he did." Tom set his coffee cup down. "He's going to figure it out before the panel may, if he hasn't already." "That's all right," I said. "He was always going to figure it out. The only question was when." Across the room, I heard Dorothy's voice rise slightly, the social register she used when she was managing a situation. I turned. Gerald had found her. I was standing at Dorothy's table with Brandon beside him, and even from across the room I could read Gerald's body the way I had read it for 30 years, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who has just been told something that has rearranged his understanding of a situation he believed he had completely under control. Dorothy looked at me across the room, one brief level look. Then she turned back to Gerald and said something I could not hear. I watched Brandon's face. He was holding something against his chest with his right arm, flat and rectangular, pressed close the way you carry something you are afraid of setting down. I knew what it was. He had brought the photographs. Whatever Dorothy was saying to Gerald, Brandon was not listening to it. Brandon was looking at me across the crowded hotel ballroom through the movement of 200 people. My son was looking at his mother with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was 9 years old and had broken something valuable and come to find me not to confess, but simply because I was the person he came to when the world felt too large. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I looked away because there were things that needed to happen first and because Brandon needed to stand in what he had found a little longer before I could meet him in it. At 7:15, I walked to the staging area behind the main hall. Victor was there reviewing his notes with Carol beside him, and two individuals I did not know personally, but recognized by their credentials, federal agents plainclothes who had been coordinating with the prosecutor's office since the documentation package was delivered nearly 2 weeks ago. "She's in the building," Victor said quietly. "Arrived 11 minutes ago. East entrance." "All right," I said. At 7:28, the lights in the main hall dimmed. At 7:29, the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium and said in the warm, carrying voice of a man who has introduced important people for 30 years, "Ladies and gentlemen, the founder and chairman of Collins Capital Group." I walked out into the light. "I am about to step into that light, and I need you with me for this. Comment the number 8 below. Let me see you there. Because 30 years of patience is about to become the loudest thing in that room. Please note some of what follows is fictional, built to carry something worth feeling. If this is where you choose to stop, I understand completely. But if you are still here, you earned this moment too." The light was warm and very bright, and for exactly 1 second, I stood at the edge of the stage and let my eyes adjust. 200 people in a room that had gone completely still. I found Gerald's face first. Not because I was looking for it, but because 30 years of marriage teaches you where a person stands in any room, the particular coordinates of someone you have organized your life around. He was standing near the center aisle, and the color had left his face entirely, and his mouth was open in the way of a man whose next sentence has simply ceased to exist. Brandon was 3 feet behind him. He was holding the photographs with both hands now. I walked to the podium. I spoke for 12 minutes about Collins Capital Group's investment priorities for the coming year, the infrastructure fund, the healthcare initiative, the regional development partnerships we had been building quietly for the better part of a decade. I spoke the way I always spoke in rooms like this one, with the particular calm of someone who has done the preparation and trusts it. And the 200 people in that ballroom were very quiet, in the way that people are quiet when they understand they are hearing something that matters. Halfway through, Victor stepped onto the stage. He presented the findings of our internal audit, in the precise, unhurried language of a man who has reviewed every number 3 times and is certain of each one. 23 contracts, 4 years. $3,240,000 extracted through a vendor account established specifically for that purpose. He named no crimes that was for the prosecutor's office to determine, but he presented the arithmetic, and arithmetic does not require interpretation. Near the east corridor, I saw the 2 plainclothes agents move. Diane had been standing near the bar with a glass she had not touched. When she saw them coming, she took 3 quick steps toward the service exit and then stopped because there were 2 more agents at the service exit and there was nowhere left to go. She said something I could not hear from the stage. One of the agents responded briefly. She did not fight it. She simply lowered her head and they walked her out, and the room watched it happen with the particular silence of people witnessing a consequence they had not anticipated but immediately understood. I finished my remarks. Afterwards, stepping down from the stage, I found Gerald blocking my path. His hands were shaking visibly, and his voice, when he finally produced it, came out thinner than I had ever heard it. May. Just my name, as though he had forgotten everything that came after it. I looked at him for a long moment. This man, I had chosen this man. I had built a life beside this man who had looked at 30 years of my work and seen nothing worth noticing. "I know, Gerald," I said quietly. "I know." Then I stepped around him and walked toward my son. Brandon met me halfway. He was moving through the crowd before I had taken 3 steps from Gerald, pushing past people who turned to look at him, and then at me, with the particular curiosity of witnesses who understand they are watching something private happen in a public place. His face was not composed. His eyes were red at the edges, and his jaw was working the way it does when a person is trying to hold themselves together through the sheer force of not speaking yet. He stopped in front of me and held out the photographs with both hands, the way a child returns something borrowed and long overdue. "I found these," he said. His voice broke cleanly in the middle of the sentence. "In the house, in your office." "I know," I said. "Mom." He said it the way he had not said it in years. Not May, not a name called toward a kitchen without looking up. But Mom with the full weight of what that word is supposed to mean pressing behind it. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I took the photographs from his hands and looked down at the top one. Myself at 35 standing in a conference room in Boston with 3 men whose companies appeared regularly in the financial press, all of us caught mid-laugh by a photographer who had excellent timing. I looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. I had belonged exactly where I was. "I wanted you to know me first," I said, "before you knew what I had built." Brandon made a sound that was not quite a word. His hands, now empty, curled at his sides, and then he stepped forward and put his arms around me, the way he had not done since he was a boy. Not a polite embrace, not the careful hug of a grown son, performing affection at the appropriate moment, but something real and slightly desperate, the grip of someone who has just understood the size of what they almost lost. I held him, not briefly, not with the careful restraint of a woman who has spent 30 years managing her own emotions so that other people would not have to witness them. I held my son in the middle of a hotel ballroom with 200 people around us, and I let it be what it was. After a long moment, I felt him pull back slightly. He kept his hands on my arms. "I have so much to apologize for," he said. "Yes," I said, "you do." He laughed once, a broken sound. "You're not going to make this easy." "I was never the one who made things easy," I said. "That was always your father's version of me. It was never actually me." Brandon wiped his face with the back of his hand. Behind him, across the thinning crowd, I could see Gerald standing exactly where I had left him. He had not moved. Dorothy was beside him now, not speaking, simply present in the way she was present for things that required witness rather than words. Gerald was looking at me. I had spent 30 years learning to read that face, and what I saw in it now was not anger and not calculation, and not the managed performance of a man deciding how to respond strategically to an unexpected development. What I saw was something older and plainer than any of those things. He looked like a man who had just been shown a room that had been in his own house the entire time, a room he had walked past every single day and understood for the first time what he had never once opened the door to find. I did not go to him. There was nothing left between us that required my presence to resolve. Whatever Gerald Collins needed to understand about the life he had chosen, he would have to find his way to it without me as his guide. That was no longer my work. I looked at him for a moment across the room. Then I turned back to my son. "Keep the photographs," I said, pressing them back into Brandon's hands. "Not as a reminder of who I was, as a reminder of who you still have the chance to become. There is a difference, and it matters." Brandon looked down at the photographs, then back at me. "Will you give me the chance to show you?" "That depends entirely on what you do next," I said, "not on what you say tonight." He nodded. Slowly, with the particular gravity of someone receiving a condition they know they have no right to argue with. Dorothy appeared at my elbow. She handed me my coat without commentary, which was its own form of commentary, and looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments when she had been right about something for a very long time and was choosing not to say so. "Ready," she said. I put on my coat. I looked once more at the room, the ballroom, the remaining guests, the podium where I had stood 12 minutes ago, and told the truth about something I had been building for 30 years. Gerald still standing in the same spot, smaller somehow than he had ever looked to me before. Brandon holding the photographs. "More than I have ever been," I said. Dorothy and I walked out together through the main doors and into the night air, which was cold and sharp and tasted faintly of the river 2 blocks east. The same river I had driven past that morning on the way, in the same city I had been working in quietly for 30 years, while the people in my house looked right through me. It felt stepping out into it exactly like beginning. There comes a point in a woman's life when she stops explaining herself. Not because she has given up, because she has finally remembered that she never owed the explanation in the first place. I built something real. I protected it through 30 years of deliberate invisibility, and I walked away from a table that had never set a place for who I actually was, and I did not burn anything down on my way out. If this story found its way to something true in you today, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a thought in the comments. I read every one, and if you believe that quiet strength deserves its moment in the light, I hope you will stay a while. There are more stories where this one came from, and every one of them belongs to someone who was told at some point that they were not quite enough. They were always enough. They simply needed someone to finally stop looking past them. I used to think that staying quiet was the same as keeping peace. It is not. It never was. God has a way of returning to us everything we were willing to walk away from, including ourselves. These family revenge stories are never really about revenge. They are about women who waited too long to remember their own worth. I was one of them. These revenge stories with Mom at the center always begin the same way, with a woman who gave everything and was handed silence in return. Do not do what I did. Do not mistake patience for permission to disappear. Do not fold yourself small because someone else needs the space. That is my advice, plainly and without apology. I believe quiet strength is the most dangerous kind. These family revenge stories prove it every time. And the revenge stories with Mom that end with dignity, not destruction, those are the ones that stay with you. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe and stay close, there is more coming. Thank you for being here until the very end. It means everything. The stories ahead blend fiction and truth, built to illuminate what is real. If that is not for you, no judgment, choose what serves you. But if you are staying, I am glad.